My name is Pastor Hal York, and welcome to Truth in the Trenches. We find ourselves once again in Proverbs chapter 7, faced with a young man described in verse 7 as a simple young man, a young man lacking a heart of wisdom or lacking sense, as one version puts it. A young man who has been warned time and time again about the dangers of playing around with immorality, but he doesn't listen. Why? Because he doesn't want to listen. He doesn't believe the warnings. He doesn't want to miss out on what everybody else seems to be doing. But I want us to look carefully at what happens to this senseless young man. We've talked about this many, many times. Listen to these verses we find in chapter 7. With her abundant persuasion, she entices him. With her flattering lips, she drives him to herself. He suddenly follows her, and as an ox goes to the slaughter, or as one in fetters to the discipline of an ignorant fool, until an arrow pierces through his liver, and as a bird hastens to the snare, and he does not know that it will cost him his life. Here's a senseless young man playing around with something he knows he shouldn't be doing. He's been warned time and time again. He thinks he can get away with something. He thinks he can avoid the disaster he's been warned about. He's become wise in his own eyes. But there's a phrase in this verse that should strike us very quickly. With her flattering lips, she drives him to herself. Her words drive this young man to her. It not just draws or lures, it's past that. He's a slave now of his passions. Her flattering words are feeding that passion, and he's being driven like an ox to the slaughter. He's caught in the current, and he's being driven over the falls into certain disaster. But our verse for today reminds us of something especially young people are not as aware of as they should be. In Proverbs 10:7, we read this, "And behold, a woman comes to meet him, dressed as a harlot and cunning of heart." This young person, senseless person, is passing by her corner, heading down her street. And she comes to meet him, dressed like what he's looking for. The temptation will meet the opportunity. The evil one will make sure the opportunity you're looking for comes to meet you. Satan doesn't know your heart, and I don't believe he can read our minds. But he does know what you've been looking at. He sees what you're reading. He saw you roll your eyes at your parents or friends who warned you about playing with temptation. He hears you mocking the advice they gave you to your buddies. He hears us talk. He can read our texts. He knows our habits. He knows the lies you told to those around you to hide where you're actually going. And now, young person, he knows what street you just went down. And as we've said many times, chapters 5 to 7 of Proverbs pointedly, even graphically at times, warn us. You mess around with sin, especially sexual sin, and you're playing with fire. And the warning is, don't see how close you can get to sin without sinning. That is a fool's game. That's the game this young man is playing. He thinks he's in control. He can just walk away. He's just curious. He can handle it. But he's there. And notice what happens as she comes to meet him, flattering him. And maybe he's totally caught off guard. Or maybe this was what he was hoping for. Either way, the trap springs and he's caught in the cords of his sin. And verse 13 says she seizes him. And I've seen it happen so often, and I'm sure you have too. A young person, maybe a teenager, a college-age person, in their heart, maybe is in their home a bit rebellious. They're playing around with sin, maybe with drugs or immorality. But they get into high school or go away to college. And it seems like it takes no time at all before they have found people who are just like them. A little bit rebellious, experimenting with drugs, immorality. And it's like a magnet. They're drawn to these people. Or based on these verses, the question may be, is who found who? But it happens all the time. I've seen kids go away to colleges with 30,000 kids, Christian colleges. Every college has this bad element, as you know. But it's amazing that they just seem to find one another. But I think sometimes the question is who found who. But she meets him. She comes to meet him, flattering him. Satan knows where you are. And he knows what's going on in your life. He knows your habits. And it says she seizes him. Those are very daunting words, and she's very cunning as well, cunning at heart. Are we as parents wise? Are we as believers wise in how we deal with our flesh? Do we feed it, or do we deny it? Are we playing around with sin? Are we seeing how far we can get close to sin, how close we can get to sin without actually sinning? That is a fool's game. And suddenly, she seizes him. She comes to meet him. I was listening to a series on Proverbs by Paul Washer. A great series is on YouTube. I encourage anybody to listen to it. He goes in verse by verse. It's very, very well done. Every young person needs to listen to that. But he made this statement. He says, the Christian should not be one who lives and learns, but one who learns and lives. God wants us to be wise. He wants us to avoid the pitfalls and heartbreak sin can bring, especially sexual sin. He wants us to learn the Scriptures. He wants us to believe the Scriptures, and he wants us to obey them. He wants us to fear the Lord because that is the beginning of wisdom. Yes, there's forgiveness when we sin, and we can thank God for that in his grace. He does forgive, and he cleanses from all unrighteousness. But there's no magic wand that cancels the consequences of sin in our life. Sometimes they can be lifelong consequences. How much better to learn how to walk in the power of the Spirit, to walk in the abundant life Christ gives to those who follow him and obey him, to learn how to resist temptation, to be aware of Satan's tactics, of his cunning, to be on guard, to be serious about living a godly, Christ-honoring, Christ-centered life. Are we teaching our children about the dangers of sin and the subtlety of Satan? A rebellious heart, a heart that doesn't want to listen, is easy pickings for the cunning subtlety of the tempter. Are we teaching our children to be wise? Teaching them about the knowledge of God? Teaching them so they can learn and live, instead of live and learn the hard way? God doesn't want you to learn the hard way. He wants to teach you to be wise. Even as we as adults, are we always learning the hard way? May we learn and live and walk in the abundant life Christ has promised us, instead of live and learn the hard way. That's what these verses are reminding us of and warning us of. Behold, a woman comes to meet him, dressed as a harlot, cunning of heart. She seizes him. Don't play with sin. Don't play with sexual sin. You're playing with fire. Can a man take fire to his bosom and not be burned? The answer is no, 1,000 times no. Learn and live. Don't live and learn the hard way. May this truth guide us and guard us in the trenches of life as we seek to live for the glory of God and the good of others. May God bless.